As it is claimed to be unphilosophical to inquire into first causes, scientists now occupy themselves with considering their physical effects. The field of scientific investigation is therefore bounded by physical nature. When once its limits are reached, inquiry must stop and their work be recommenced. With all due respect to our learned men, they are like the squirrel upon its revolving wheel, for they are doomed to turn their matter over and over again. Science is a mighty potency, and it is not for us pygmies to question her, but the scientists are not themselves science embodied, any more than the men of our planet are the planet itself. We have neither the right to demand nor power to compel our modern-day philosopher to accept without challenge a geographical description of the dark side of the moon. Why then should we feel so reluctant to admit the possibility that if the antediluvians were so much better versed than ourselves in certain sciences as to have been perfectly acquainted with the important arts which we now term lost, they might have equally excelled in psychological knowledge? Such a hypothesis must be considered as reasonable as any other until some countervailing evidence shall be discovered to destroy it. Every true savant admits that in many respects human knowledge is yet in its infancy. The cosmological theory of numerals, which Pythagoras learned from the Egyptian hierophants, is alone able to reconcile the two units, matter and spirit, and cause each to demonstrate the other mathematically. The sacred numbers of the universe in their esoteric combination solve the great problem and explain the theory of radiation and the cycle of the emanations. The lower orders, before they develop into higher ones, must emanate from the higher spiritual ones, and when arrived at the turning point, be reabsorbed again into the infinite. Even Plato and Philo-Judaeus have been accused by many a commentator of absurd inconsistencies, whereas the design which underlies the maze of metaphysical contradictions so perplexing to the reader of the Timaeus is but too evident. But has Plato ever been read understandingly by one of the expounders of the classics? Ought not one who undertakes to edit another's works at least understand what his author means? The speculations of these philosophers upon matter were open to public criticism, but their teachings in regard to spiritual things were profoundly esoteric. Being thus sworn to secrecy and religious silence upon abstruse subjects involving the relations of spirit and matter, they rivaled each other in their ingenious methods for concealing their real opinions. The solution of the great problem of eternity belongs neither to religious superstition nor to gross materialism. The harmony and mathematical equiformity of the double evolutions, spiritual and physical, are elucidated only in the universal numerals of Pythagoras, who built his system entirely upon the so-called metrical speech of the Hindu Vedas. Plato, the ardent disciple of Pythagoras, realized it so fully as to maintain that the dodecahedron was the geometrical figure employed by the demiurgus in constructing the universe. Pythagoras and Plato knew well this astronomical truth, for Pythagoras obtained his knowledge in India, or from men who had been there, and Plato faithfully echoed his teachings. And now we will present the testimony upon which we base our assertion that the Hindus were perfectly acquainted with the heliocentric system, at least 2,000 years BC. In the same treatise, the Hotar, priest, is taught how the Shastras should be repeated and how the phenomena of sunrise and sunset are to be explained. It says, "The Agnishtoma is that one, that God, who burns. The sun never sets nor rises. When people think the sun is setting, it is not so. They are mistaken. For after having arrived at the end of the day, it produces two opposite effects, making night to what is below and day to what is on the other side. When they, the people, believe it rises in the morning, the sun only does thus. Having reached the end of the night, it makes itself produce two opposite effects, making day to what is below and night to what is on the other side. In fact, the sun never sets, nor does it set for him who has such a knowledge." The calendar of the Aztecs gave an equal number of days and weeks to each month, The extreme accuracy of their astronomical calculations was so great that no error has been discovered in their reckoning by subsequent verifications, while the Europeans who landed in Mexico in 1519 were, by the Julian calendar, nearly 11 days in advance of the exact time. The Brahmanas describe the religious contest between the ancient Hindus who lived in the pre-Vedic period and the Iranians. The battles between the Devas and the Asuras, the former representing the Hindus and the latter the Iranians, are described at length in the sacred books. The rabble has been the same in all ages. Materialism has been and will ever be blind to spiritual truths. The astral man, intangible and invisible as he might be to our mortal earthly senses, is still constituted of matter, though sublimated. The translators of the Jewish sacred books have even changed the spelling of the name of God. El, if written correctly, would read Al, for it stands in the original Al, and according to Higgins, this word means the god Mithra, the sun, the preserver and savior. The ancient Kabbalist rested upon no hypothesis till he could lay its basis upon the firm rock of recorded experiment. But the too great dependence upon physical facts led to a growth of materialism and a decadence of spirituality and faith. At the time of Aristotle, this was the prevailing tendency of thought, and though the Delphic commandment was not as yet completely eliminated from Grecian thought, and some philosophers still held that in order to know what man is, we ought to know what man was. Still, materialism had already begun to gnaw at the root of faith. The mysteries themselves had degenerated in a very great degree into mere priestly speculations and religious fraud. Few were the true adepts and initiates, the heirs and descendants of those who had been dispersed by the conquering swords of various invaders of old Egypt. The time predicted by the great Hermes in his dialogue with Aesculapius had indeed come, the time when impious foreigners would accuse Egypt of adoring monsters, and naught but the letters engraved in stone upon her monuments would survive. Enigmas, incredible to posterity. Their sacred scribes and hierophants were wanderers upon the face of the earth, obliged from fear of a profanation of the sacred mysteries to seek refuge among the Hermetic fraternities, known later as the Essenes. Their esoteric knowledge was buried deeper than ever. The triumphant brand of Aristotle's pupil swept away from his path of conquest every vestige of a once pure religion, and Aristotle himself, the type and child of his epoch, though instructed in the secret science of the Egyptians, knew but little of this crowning result of millenniums of esoteric studies. As well as those who lived in the days of the Semitics, that's P-S-A-M-M-E-T-I-C-S, not Semitics. Our present-day philosophers lift the veil of Isis, for Isis is but the symbol of nature, but they see only her physical forms. The soul within escapes their view, and the Divine Mother has no answer for them. There are anatomists who, uncovering to sight no indwelling spirit under the layers of muscles, the network of nerves, or the cinereous matter, which they lift with the point of the scalpel, assert that man has no soul. Such are as purblind in sophistries the student, who, confining his research to the cold letter of the Kabbalah, dares say it has no vivifying spirit. To see the true man who once inhabited the subject which lies before him on the dissecting table, the surgeon must use other eyes than those of his body. So, the glorious truth covered up in the hieratic writings of the ancient papyri can be revealed only to him who possesses the faculty of intuition, which, if we call reason the eye of the mind, may be defined as the eye of the soul. Maimonides, the great Jewish theologian and historian who at one time was almost deified by his countrymen and afterward treated as a heretic, remarks that the more absurd and void of sense the Talmud seems, the more sublime is the secret meaning. In the oldest documents now in our possession, the Vedas and the older laws of Manu, we find many magical rites practiced and permitted by the Brahmins. The greatest teachers of divinity agree that nearly all ancient books were written symbolically and in a language intelligible only to the initiated. The biographical sketch of Apollonius of Tyana affords an example. The Babylonians had fixed the length of a tropical year within 25 seconds of the truth. Their estimate of the sidereal year was barely 2 minutes in excess. They had detected the precession of the equinoxes. They knew the causes of eclipses, and by the aid of their cycle called Saros, they could predict them. Their estimate of the value of that cycle, which is more than 6,585 days, was within 19.5 minutes of the truth. The symbols of all the mythologies have a scientific foundation and substance. The deification of mortal men and supposititious gods is no more proof against their monotheism than the monument building of modern Christians who erect statues to their heroes is proof of their polytheism. Americans of the present century would consider it absurd in their posterity 3,000 years hence to classify them as idolaters for having built statues to their god Washington. Moses was indebted for his knowledge to the mother of the Egyptian princess, Thermuthis, who saved him from the waters of the Nile. Origen, who had belonged to the Alexandrian school of Platonists, declares that Moses, besides the teachings of the covenant, communicated some very important secrets from the hidden depths of the law to the 70 elders. The clergy of the three most prominent Christian bodies, the Greek, Roman Catholic, and Protestant, discountenance every spiritual phenomenon manifesting itself through the so-called mediums. A very brief period indeed has elapsed since both the two latter ecclesiastical corporations burned, hanged, and otherwise murdered every helpless victim through whose organisms spirits, and sometimes blind and as yet unexplained forces of nature, manifested themselves. At the head of these three churches, preeminent stands the Church of Rome. Her hands are scarlet with the innocent blood of countless victims shed in the name of a Moloch-like divinity at the head of her creed. She is ready and eager to begin again, but she is bound hand and foot by that 19th century spirit of progress and religious freedom which she reviles and blasphemes daily. The Greco-Russian Church is the most amiable and Christ-like in her primitive, simple, though blind faith. Despite the fact that there has been no practical union between the Greek and Latin churches and that the two parted company long centuries ago, the Roman pontiffs seem to invariably ignore the fact. They have, in the most impudent manner possible, arrogated to themselves jurisdiction not only over the countries within the Greek communion, but also over all Protestants as well. The Church insists, says Professor Draper, that the state has no rights over anything which it declares to be within its domain, and that the Protestantism, being a mere rebellion, has no rights at all, that even in Protestant communities the Catholic bishop is the only lawful spiritual pastor. Decrees unheeded, encyclical letters unread, invitations to ecumenical councils unnoticed, excommunications laughed at, all these have seemed to make no difference. Their persistence has only been matched by their effrontery. In 1864, the culmination of absurdity was attained when Pius IX excommunicated and fulminated publicly his anathemas against the Russian emperor as a schismatic cast-out from the bosom of the Holy Mother Church. Neither he nor his ancestors, nor Russia since it was Christianized 1,000 years ago, have ever consented to join the Roman Catholics. Why not claim ecclesiastical jurisdiction over the Buddhists of Tibet or the shadows of the ancient Hyksos? How many of our inveterate skeptics belong, notwithstanding their materialism, to Masonic lodges? Brothers of the Rosy Cross, mysterious practitioners of the medieval ages, still live, but in name only. They may shed tears at the grave of their respectable master, Hiram Abif, but vainly will they search for the true locality where the sprig of myrtle was placed. The dead letter remains alone. The spirit has fled. This darkness can only be dispelled by the light of the blazing torch of truth, which alone the right descendants of Ormazd carry. They alone can teach you the true pronunciation of the name revealed to Enoch, Jacob, and Moses. According to the claims of the Babylonian priests, corroborated by Eupolemus, the city of Babylon owes its foundation to those who were saved from the catastrophe of the deluge. They were the giants, and they built the tower which is noticed in history. Verily then, to antiquity alone have we to look for the origin of all things. How well Hargrave Jennings expresses himself when speaking of pyramids, and how true are his words when he asks, "Is it at all reasonable to conclude at a period when knowledge was at the highest, and when the human powers were, in comparison with ours at the present time, prodigious, that all these indomitable, scarcely believable physical effects, that such achievements as those of the Egyptians were devoted to a mistake, that the myriads of the Nile were fools laboring in the dark, and that all the magic of their great men was forgery, and that we, in despising that which we call their superstition and wasted power, are alone the wise? No, there is much more in these old religions than probably in the audacity of modern denial, in the confidence of these superficial science times, and in the derision of these days without faith, is in the least degree supposed. We do not understand the old time. Thus we see how classic practice and heathen teaching may be made to reconcile, how even the Gentile and the Hebrew, the mythological and the Christian doctrine harmonize in the general faith founded on magic. That magic is indeed possible is the moral of this book. Too many of our thinkers do not consider that the numerous changes in language, the allegorical phraseology and evident secretiveness of old mystic writers who were generally under an obligation never to divulge the solemn secrets of the sanctuary, might have sadly misled translators and commentators. The phrases of the medieval alchemist they read literally, and even the veiled symbology of Plato is commonly misunderstood by the modern scholar. One day they may learn to know better and so become aware that the method of extreme necessarianism was practiced in ancient as well as in modern philosophy. That from the first stages of man, the fundamental truths of all that we are permitted to know on earth was in the safekeeping of the adepts of the sanctuary. That the difference in creeds and religious practice was only external, and that those guardians of the primitive divine revelation who had solved every problem that is within the grasp of human intellect were bound together by a universal Freemasonry of science and philosophy, which formed one unbroken chain around the globe. It is for philology and psychology to find the end of the thread. That done, it will then be ascertained that by relaxing one single loop of the old religious systems, the chain of mystery may be disentangled. The neglect and withholding of these proofs have driven such eminent minds as Hare and Wallace and other men of power to the fold of modern spiritualism. And at the same time, it has forced others, congenitally devoid of spiritual intuitions, into a gross materialism that figures under various names. But we see no utility in prosecuting the subject further. For though in the opinion of most of our contemporaries there has been but one day of learning, and in whose twilight stood the older philosophers, and whose noontide brightness is all our own, and though the testimony of scores of ancient and medieval thinkers has proved valueless to modern experimenters, as though the world dated from AD 1 and all knowledge were of recent growth, we will not lose hope or courage. The moment is more opportune than ever for the review of old philosophies. Learned men ought to be free from preconceptions and prejudices of every kind. Yet, although thought and opinion are now free, scientists are still the same men as of old. The phenomena chase the scientists, and the scientists run away from the phenomena. Very pointedly remarks M.A.N. Aksakoff in an able article on mediumism and the St. Petersburg Scientific Committee. The attitude of this body of professors toward the subject which they had pledged themselves to investigate was throughout simply disgraceful. Their premature and prearranged report was so evidently partial and inconclusive as to call out a scornful protest even from unbelievers. Skepticism, whether it proceeds from a scientific or an ignorant brain, is unable to overturn the immortality of our souls, if such immortality is a fact, and plunge them into post-mortem annihilation. Reason is subject to error, says Aristotle. So his opinion and the personal views of the most learned philosopher are often more liable to be proved erroneous than the plain common sense of his own illiterate cook. The truth is that the professors have not yet discovered the necessary conditions of their occurrence. They must go as deeply into the study of the triple nature of man, psychological, physiological, and divine, as did their predecessors, the magicians, theurgists, and thaumaturgists of old. Conviction, says Bacon, comes not through arguments, but through experiments. Pythagoras brought his doctrines from the eastern sanctuaries, and Plato compiled them into a form more intelligible than the mysterious numerals of the sage, whose doctrines he had fully embraced to the uninitiated mind. Paracelsus, the divine, as he was called, adds in the same strain, faith must confirm the imagination, for faith establishes the will. Determined will is the beginning of all magical operations, because men do not perfectly imagine and believe the result is that the arts are uncertain, while they might be perfectly certain. The Phoenician idea of the ideal sun-light as a spiritual influence issuing from the highest god, Iao, the light conceivable only by intellect, the physical and spiritual principle of all things out of which the soul emanates. As God creates, so man can create. Given a certain intensity of will, and the shapes created by the mind become subjective. Hallucinations, they are called, although to their creator they are real as any visible object is to anyone else. Given a more intense and intelligent concentration of this will, and the form becomes concrete, visible, objective. The man has learned the secret of secrets. He is a magician. A force whose secret powers were thoroughly familiar to the ancient theurgists is denied by modern skeptics. The antediluvian children, who perhaps played with it, using it as the boys in Bulwer Lytton's Coming Race, used the tremendous vril